Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is October 3rd, 2017, and I'm your host, Cara Santa Maria. Now, this week is a fascinating episode. I'm joined by Doughty. She's a mortician and a death acceptance advocate. But before we dive into that episode, I want to let you guys know that I'm so incredibly grateful for all of your ongoing support. It's because of you that Talk Nerdy is and will always remain 100% free to download. Now, I'm actually time traveling a little bit because I'm recording this intro while I'm at home and have my equipment, but I'm about to go gallivanting across the world. I'm spending some time in Paris and some time in North Africa. And I'm actually going to be posting this episode while I am overseas. So that's why I'm not going to give specific call outs to anybody who has shown their support on Patreon or PayPal, simply because I would hate to leave anybody out. So when I get back into town, I'll make sure to give everybody credit where it's due. But in the meantime, I say we dive right in. I mentioned before, Caitlin, she actually has a brand new book. It's called From Here to Eternity, Traveling the World to Find the Good Death. As I mentioned, she is a mortician and she's also a death acceptance advocate. And she has a non-profit mortuary in Los Angeles called Undertaking LA. Just fascinating. So without any further ado, here she is, Doughty. Well, Caitlin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me in your lovely home.
Aw, I am so glad that you were able to make the terrible journey from the middle of LA.
Some people live on the west side of Los Angeles and some people live on the east side, and ne'er the twain shall meet. I feel like that's such a cliche, though. I feel like it's such a cliche to be like, oh, I had to drive to the east side. Are you serious right now?
And of course, now that I live on the east side, I'm like, the east side's awesome, but I hate going west.
Yeah, the east side is awesome, and the west side is awesome. It's just kind of an unbridgeable chasm
LA
betwixt
is big.
them. LA is very big, but some days, the feeling of leaving somewhere at 11 p.m. And drive. Like I was downtown yesterday and at night, and I looked on my phone real quick how long it would take to get home, and I was like, 9 minutes.
That's amazing.
It actually only takes 9 minutes. Why did it take, 47 minutes when I came at 5 p.m. downtown?
Yeah, I was in Boston earlier this week, and I landed on Friday night, or I should say Saturday morning at 1:30. And so I called for an Uber, and she got there really quickly. And I was asking, you like driving Uber at night? And she was like, look around.
It's freedom, awesome. Baby. Yeah.
It's a whole new LA. So yeah, thank you for making the trek. I love doing these in person. It's super rare anymore that I get to do it because, of course, although there are a ton of fascinating people in LA, there are also a ton of fascinating people all over the world. And so I'm often doing remotes, as I think the listeners can usually tell. Sometimes the sound quality is better than others, depending on the person I'm interviewing's mic. But today we're face to face.
We're like a team.
I know.
Like a radio team.
I know. We've got the big headphones on. I feel very profesh. I have met you now multiple times, which I'm very excited to say. I think we did a story for the news show I work on, KCET, or SoCal Connected on the KCET network, which is local to LA if you are listening and you're not from Southern California, but you can see all of the stuff on the web. So we did a piece about kind of, what did we call it? Death over dinner. Because part of the piece was a death and dying dinner party. And then the other part of the piece, I sat with you and you basically helped enlighten us about the process of dying, the funeral process, and some cool history lessons about, some of the things we do in the funeral home. And then I got to have you at SciComm Camp last year. You were our keynote speaker, and it was fascinating. The talk
that was so fun. It's summer camp. In Malibu.
Yeah.
It was great. And there were giant telescopes afterwards, and there was delicious food. It was one of the more fun talks.
It was really fun. And I will tell you that the guests, the campers that were there, which were all science communicators at different stages of their careers, found your talk fascinating because it's so perfectly aligned with what we do in science communication, communicating difficult topics, right? But at the same time, I think it felt a little left field for a lot of them, so it wasn't the same old, same old. And of course, you had lots of pictures of bodies, which was interesting.
Right. I find when you sprinkle your talks full of mummies and corpses, you're going to keep the attention of the group.
Absolutely. And so
it's like throwing a boob up there or something. It has the same what?
Did you notice? Yeah, so of course, people who haven't gathered by now, although you should because I time traveled and already introduced Caitlin at the beginning of the show.
I was going to say, I wonder if there's any context for who I am at all. I bet there is. I bet there will be.
Yes. Caitlin, do you have any monikers? Have people called you? I mean, are you the death lady? Are you, have people given you these nicknames before?
At Trader Joe's the other day, the checkout woman was looking at me kind of askance. She was like, are you a famous moth presenter on The Moth? And I was like, oh no, that's not me. How great would that be? No. Yeah. She was like, wait, no, but I think, have you done, I was like, I've done some TED Talks. Are you the famous mortician? And I was like, okay, yes, that's definitely me. And then she said, well, I wanted to ask you that, but I didn't want you to be offended that I said that. And I was like, wait, why would that be offensive? Why would me be she didn't want to accuse someone of morticianing if they didn't like that.
And then she tells you that and you're like, but I am a mortician.
Yeah, but that is who I am. And I am very proud of that. Nor should any of us be ashamed to be interested in death. But yeah, I think normally when I have to do a little sizzle thing and I'm like, hi, I'm Caitlin Doughty. I usually say mortician and death awareness advocate.
Mm-hmm. And that's so important, this concept of death awareness. I feel like there are two sides of what I want to dive into today, which is the side of, your book, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, and other lessons from the crematory, and all of the fun. Is that? Yeah, it is fun. All of the intense, fun, and interesting stories about how you got your start in mortuary science and kind of what you do now with your nonprofit, but also this conversation about what happens before we die and why it's important for us to be aware of that. And you're also working on a new book, aren't you?
Yeah, I finished working on it. It's coming out on October 3rd of this year, and it's called From Here to Eternity, Traveling the World to Find the Good Death.
Oh, neat. So Smoke Gets in Your Eyes was really the beginning of your career.
Exactly. Smoke Gets in Your Eyes is kind of, it's more of a straight memoir. It's about a young lady takes a job at a crematory at age 23, chaos ensues, lessons ensue, et cetera, et cetera. And then the new book is sort of half narrative nonfiction, half memoir, just about me going to different places in the world and experiencing new technology, dead bodies, corpses, ways of dealing with death, ways of understanding death that feel very foreign and in some ways very threatening to a Western audience.
Yeah, because we have a very particular relationship with death, which is we have no relationship with death here in the West.
Well, we have no relationship with death, but, and this is kind of the catalyst for the book, is that people still feel such a self-righteousness about other people's cultural choices around death and around everything. But, you see something about the mummies of South Sulawesi in Indonesia on some website, and the comments will just be, oh, this is disrespectful, this is disgusting, this is horrifying, whatever happened to rest in peace? It's like, actually, they have this very long-standing, beautiful, intimate, intricate ritual that they do with their dead bodies. And where are you getting this idea that any interaction with the dead body at all is this transgressive, disgusting act? And probably from our own culture and the messaging of our own culture, which says any interaction with a dead body, if it's not done by a mortician and a professional in a sterilized environment, is dangerous or weird or creepy or morbid.
Yeah. And so are you referring to the culture that you spoke about at SciComm Camp where they bring the dead bodies out on an annual basis?
Yes. So it's actually every 3 years.
Okay.
So they will, after someone dies, they're not considered dead, first of all. They're considered to still be in this kind of liminal space between life and death, and you can still talk to them, you can still bring them food, you can still dress them in the morning, keep them asleep in the house. And that lasts for a couple of years until the funeral is ready to take place.
Oh, wow. It can be
a couple of years. Yeah.
So are the bodies actively decomposing during this time?
Well, they have various, there's an old way that they do it, which is using tea and leaves and tanning the body essentially. And then there's a new way, which is using Western formaldehyde and just sticking them all over their body. So the bodies are becoming mummified, but they're not, bloating and decomposing in the sense of an untreated body would do.
Yeah, so there's not really an overpowering smell in the home.
There's a bit of a smell, but they'll put the body in the room and they won't come back and sleep in the same room as the body until the smell has dispersed a little bit and it's more mummified. So that will happen for a couple of years, and then they raise the money for the funeral where a pig or a buffalo is sacrificed. And at that point, the soul can really move on to the next world. But it's not over yet. They put the body into a house grave, a freestanding house grave. And every 3 years or so, depending on the village, they will bring out the bodies again and unwrap them and clean them and redress them and talk to them and interact with them. And some bodies, they do that every 3 years for years and years and years, if it was a beloved child or a beloved husband or patriarch or matriarch. And some bodies, you could see them look at it and go, I don't know that we need to, do Martha this year. Or, I don't even know if that is Martha. Who is that? We don't remember. And it's kind of the final time that somebody remembers you enough to unwrap your mummy and engage with you.
So it really has a lot to do with who your community was when you were alive and how interested they are in continuing your memory.
And that's kind of the question is, how many people would unwrap me?
Right?
Who's in my life who would choose to unwrap me and clean me and redress me?
Man, I would want to do that every 3 years for a long time. Although granted, I'd be dead, so in my view, I wouldn't know any different.
Well, you would if you were in their culture. In their culture, you would, because they could say to you, and obviously I was getting all of these things translated for me, but from my understanding, interpreted for me, but what they were saying was basically, welcome back. I brought you some cigarettes. Your daughter, she got caught up at the airport, but she's driving up tomorrow. She's going to be here. She's going to say hi. Just kind of normal conversation with the person, because it's very much believed that they're still present in some way and can interact with you.
Interesting. So
but not in a spooky, terrifying ghost way.
No, it's more like talking to somebody while they're in a coma.
Exactly.
Yeah, because a lot of people do that here. Even kind of if we know that somebody has suffered brain damage or is brain dead, we'll still often talk to them as if they're present and as if they're there. Or if we don't know what their level of consciousness is, we'll assume that their level of consciousness is high. You don't want to make the mistake of saying something in front of them that they could hear.
Right.
That's interesting. And so that's obviously one example of a time when, like you said, Westerners are very kind of self-righteous about how disrespectful. Right. Knowing that obviously, why would this culture do it if they found it disrespectful? It's like the most respectful thing they could do.
And that's the thing, is that there's not really, and I think I would stand by this, there's not a culture in the world that disrespects their dead, their own beloved dead. Obviously, there's war cultures that will disrespect another tribe or another country's dead, but never your own family, your own friends. Nobody goes into a death ritual or a death practice or a thing that you do with a dead body thinking, oh, well, I'm just going to, throw it in the trash. I don't care. Nobody ever thinks that. So just go into it assuming that their rituals hold great meaning and mean something to them.
It's such an obvious, it's empathetic, but it's such an obvious point of view that is probably so lacking by so many people.
It's so true. And that's why, and it's, exactly. It seems completely obvious, but I was finding again and again and again that not to be true from people. And it's just like, let's get our cultural relativism up and running, people, because I do think that being able to be culturally relative or understand where other cultures are coming from around death is like the gateway drug to other kinds of empathy in other areas of religion or sex or politics or whatever it is.
That's true. And I think, some people do have their lines in the sand when it comes to human rights, when it comes to violence, when it comes to different things where they say, I can be culturally empathetic up to a point, and then at a certain point, I think no culture should bend on this. But when it comes to death, right, and we're not talking murder, we're talking
Yes, we're
death.
not talking headhunting. We're not
Yes.
talking cannibalism. We're talking somebody has already died, and it's simply a choice based on their belief system as to how to handle the corpse.
Yeah, then, how could there kind of be a wrong way to do
There can't
this?
be. There honestly can't be. And nobody is coming up with, and honestly, the only times that I've heard truly wacky ideas for the dead body are from like Americans or people who are like, you know what, I want to be dropped out of the ceiling in a Game of Thrones outfit and I want Pop Goes the Weasel to be playing as I'm lying in my casket so everyone is terrified as to whether I'm going to pop up out of it. These are kind of like, agnostic Americans who are coming up with these ideas because they didn't, and rightfully so, that's fine if they didn't have much of a upbringing with ritual around it. So good for them. But, the people in Sulawesi aren't coming up with wacky new ideas of things to do. They're doing this deeply held ritual
that's been held for generations.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, there is something cool about the fact that here in America and other Western nations, I think we are kind of trying, certain groups at least are trying to be more innovative around death and more progressive around death. There is obviously always going to be a ritual, and there's nothing wrong with ritual. Ritual, I think, for a lot of people is very, very important. And so different cultures, even here in the West, I think hold these deep rituals. You have some religious rituals that are very different, let's say, for different denominations of Christianity than Jewish denominations, for example. I don't think you call them denominations, but then Jewish individuals and some more Eastern religions that have made their way into the West. And then, of course, people like myself who are atheist or other, agnostic, humanist, whatever, who maybe don't care as much about ritual, but sometimes they do it for the family or sometimes they try and split the difference, right, to make sure everybody's happy. And so it's cool. I mean, if you really think about all the people in your life that you've lost and you think about how different their funerals were and how different what happened to the body was, you can be cremated and you can be buried and but at the same time, there is probably a lot of consistency in our like strange, uncomfortable, fear-based relationship with death here in the West. Do you find that that's like specific to the West?
I do, and I think it's specific to America more than anywhere else.
Really?
It's a Western concept, but I think America specifically, what's happened is we have such strict laws around how death is done, how funeral homes are run, and they're protectionist. They're economic protectionism for the funeral industry. That's just a fact. That's not my, sassy opinion. That's true. And what happens in that situation is that you have this incredible diversity of immigrant cultures that come in, and they're all swallowed up into this kind of cookie cutter system of death. And it's just a travesty because you have these cultures that are more than capable. And I will say that some cultures, Jewish culture, Muslim culture, for example, have done a really good job of resisting the funeral industrial complex in America and saying, no, we're going to continue to at least have these sections of cemeteries where we can do what we want and
but that's
funeral
usually
homes
what they have
that we
to
can do.
Right? They have to have their
own
cemeteries.
Of course. Yeah, of course they do. Yeah. And so, that's just swallowing up these cultures and spitting them back out in these bland cookie cutter Americanized death rituals. And it's such a shame because if you're coming in with a culture that already provides you this really good framework for how to die, how to mourn, how to do something with the body, that can be really nice. And like you, I am agnostic, so I don't have a framework myself necessarily. But if you do have one, why would you want it to be chewed up and spat out by this really bland system? And it ends up with not really anyone being happy.
Yeah, and I mean, let's be 100% honest, it's crazy expensive.
It's very expensive. The average funeral is something like $7,000 to $8,000, and that's not even including the plot if you choose to go the cemetery route. That's just the funeral, the casket, the makeup, the embalming, etc. And honestly, part of why I keep doing the work that I do is that people, especially 20s, 30s, 40s, people who are younger, say so consistently, I went to a funeral with an embalmed body and it just kind of creeped me out.
Yeah.
I didn't really like it. It didn't look like the person. They didn't quite look dead, but they didn't look real either. And I just had a negative experience. And if you're an industry and people are consistently saying, I'm just not having a good experience, why do you keep beating the dead horse of the structure of your industry? And funeral directors are just so terrified of what innovation and change would mean both to their bottom line economically and their sense of self as funeral directors and pillars of the community and people with this very special sacred task of caring for the dead.
Yeah, there is this very specific experience that probably anybody who's listening who has been to a funeral, at least here in the States, has had, which is like a little morbid, a little uncomfortable. I remember going to my grandfather's funeral. My grandmother's funeral was different. It was much more recent and it was quite beautiful. But my grandfather's funeral was, I mean, it was, first of all, it was Catholic, so it was crazy weird to me because there was so much ritual, and there's a lot of like kneeling and standing up and kneeling and standing up, and the pallbearers and the death shroud, and which I get though. I think that was meaningful. But also, my grandmother was psychotic that day, and I remember like standing there and her saying, "Go pay your respects." Well, I don't really want to go to the open good. Go! Like, you need to go. Okay.
Kiss his face.
Yeah. And it was, you're right. It was like he looked rubbery. He didn't look like himself. He definitely wasn't the person I remembered. He almost looked way younger than he should have, which was weird. And it was like, what do you do? I get it if you're, someone's like lover or someone's father or daughter, that maybe during those final, it's the closure and you want to hold their hand and you want to touch them. But for me, I just kind of stood there awkwardly until I felt like enough time had passed and then moved on.
Yeah.
Which I think is what a lot of people do in that weird procession.
Yeah. And so that's why the sort of linchpin of the advocacy that I do is, first of all, considering not embalming the body, because the body is just as safe without embalming. It's just as, fine to touch and be around without embalming. And the body will look exactly like the person who died. There'll be no change. It'll look like they're either sleeping or over time it will look like they're dead, which, surprise, spoiler, they are.
Yeah.
And what I think that does too is when you're not embalming, when you don't give the body right over to the funeral home, you're erasing that moment of walking up to the casket and just being there for a moment and making that memory of the kind of waxy body of your grandfather. And you go and you just sit with the body. You sit with the body until something shifts and it becomes normalized for you. And I really have a problem with the structure of the modern wake because I think it does a lot of disservice to people's grieving process. There's a lot of introverted people, myself included, who don't like the idea of going to have to briefly perform grief in front of people for a short period of time. If my mom dies, if my dad dies, I want to just sit there with them for hours. I want to sit there with them. I want to let whatever happens. I want to be present in a way that I could never do at a huge public wake where I only get 5 minutes to peek in at the body.
And you probably also want to do it in a safe environment.
In a safe environment. And that's actually a big part of the new book that I wrote is about spaces, and the way that other cultures and even cultures within the United States who are doing something radically different, they create such a safe space. Safe space, the idea is kind of mocked now, but it's what it is. It's a place where you can emotionally feel safe, where you physically feel safe, where aesthetically it's really beautiful, and you just feel like held in this swaddle of contentment and being able to be there. And that doesn't mean you can't grieve and cry and freak out and do whatever you want, but in fact, that swaddling of the space allows you to do that, where you would never, most of us, I would say, wouldn't be okay with breaking down and truly feeling the level of emotion that we want to feel at a more traditional American funeral.
So let's take a moment to talk about exactly what it is you're doing now, as opposed to, if you read Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, you'll get a good story of Caitlin's start, basically you were a crematory operator.
Exactly. I was the one cremating the bodies. That was my first job in the industry.
So this was pre-mortuary school. You didn't really know much mortuary science yet. You were just kind of thrown into it was trial by fire, literally.
Yes, trial by literal fire.
Yes, and you were learning you were starting, I think, as you can tell through the memoir, to get a deeper understanding of people's relationship or lack thereof with death, and how kind of medicinalized, maybe hospitalized death had become in the United States, how easy it is to just make a phone call and say, grandma's gone, can you come pick up the body and get rid of it, and just never really interact after that. And also, there's some funny stuff in it, some sad stuff in it, some really kind of meaningful and I think deep things in it. You did such a great job in this book. I don't know if it is a positive thing for an author or a negative thing for an author to compare them to another author. So I will tread lightly. But
okay. Well, depends who it is.
I definitely see a lot of parallels with this book and the way that Mary Roach writes, which is that it's funny and it walks right up to the line of, potentially offending somebody, but never quite does, because it's always quite sincere and comes from a very understanding and empathic place. And so I love that about the book, because I have a morbid curiosity with death. I love reading about death. If you look at my bookshelf and take a step back, you notice that a lot of the books that I've chosen to read that weren't assigned to me or that I didn't need to read for work have themes of death and disease and dying and gerontology and kind of what's it all for. And so the book really, really affected me, which is why when we did the KCET piece, I immediately was like, Caitlin, let's find Caitlin. So after you worked as basically an assistant, a crematory operator, but you were an assistant to somebody who had a license there in the crematory, then you decided this is what I want to do. This cemented it for you and made you want to go to mortuary school.
It did. Well, it made me a revolutionary very quick. So I was 23, I was doing this job, and we were talking about earlier when we were getting our tea before the podcast that it was crematories in general are kind of big warehouses outside the city. They tend to be on the dirty side. They're just very industrial environments. And while I was there, sometimes people would come in to watch the cremation and be present. And it was really beautiful, but it was fairly rare that would happen. And so right away, I was seeing exactly what you were talking about earlier happening, us picking up the body and the family just never seeing the body again and having nothing to do with the funeral and having nothing to do with the cremation. And they just come pick up the ashes, or we mail them the ashes to Nebraska or wherever.
Yeah.
And that didn't seem right to me. And I'm certainly I don't have a problem with anyone doing that. But what I got a sense of is people did not know that something else was possible. They thought it was either have a $10,000 funeral home with the makeup and the casket and the embalming, or do what's called a direct cremation, where off the body goes and you never see it again.
Either straight from home or straight from the hospital.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's no in-between area. And that's what I thought that could really be reformed and that needed to be reformed for sort of the soul of our mourning culture in the West in general. And so I decided to go back to mortuary school, not because in California it's required to get a license to go to mortuary school. There are states where that's the case. But in California, if you have an associate's degree and you can pass this big test, which is somewhat hard if you don't go to mortuary school, but definitely doable. I could have just gone that route because I already had a bachelor's, but I decided I wanted to go to mortuary school because I wanted to embalm. I wanted to see what they were teaching people. I wanted to see where the culture of death was created.
So mortuary school is both hands-on, but also the theory and some of the chemistry and the science behind it.
Exactly. It's embalming. It's embalming lab where you actually do the hands-on embalming. And it's also circulatory system and diseases and mortuary accounting and a little bit of cultural stuff as well.
Gotcha. So I have to ask, what's your degree in?
My degree is in mortuary. Oh, my first degree?
Your first degree,
My first degree is in medieval history.
I love that. So you have a bachelor's in medieval history and a bachelor's in mortuary science.
Well, it's an associate's in mortuary
Oh,
science.
that's funny because they don't do like.
Well, they just started a bachelor's program at the school that I went to, but like, without being rude, it is completely unnecessary to get a bachelor's degree in mortuary science.
Gotcha.
I mean, this is coming from a person who has a bachelor's degree in medieval history, so I may not be the best person to judge what's like a necessary degree to get, but it's just mortuary school is essentially trade school. It's a trade school, and you just don't make enough money when you leave to justify a bachelor's degree,
Gotcha.
in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's not offered in a traditional, like I couldn't go to USC and study mortuary science.
No,
I would have to go to a vocational school to do it.
Well, it's at Cypress College, which is in Orange County, and it is you can get your associate's degree there. It's kind of a community college, but it also has like a nursing school and a dental assistant school and these sort of more vocational schools there
that are kind of
as
medically
well.
aligned.
Exactly,
Yeah.
medical vocational schools. And that's really what it is and what it should be. It should be a 2-year program, if that teaches. But also they are doing some reforms now, but honestly at the time that I went, they weren't they were teaching to this big national test called the National Board, which isn't really reflective, I think, of the changing industry, which is a problem in a lot of industries.
Yeah, I could see that. And the truth of the matter, or at least it seems from the outside, is that to be a good mortician, you just need to do it. You just need to be around death.
You need to do it. You need to be around death. You need to make sure you're comfortable with the dead body. And you need to be really comfortable with people, with living people. And people always have this idea of, oh, I'm going to be a mortician. It's going to be goth as hell. It's going to be really fun. I don't have to deal with people. And then they plunk you down in front of a sobbing family. And if you don't have people skills, the funeral director that I work with now, she has a background in nonprofit, but she also has waited tables, high-end tables in LA for years. And that makes her such an asset because she just has really excellent customer service skills and people skills. And the deal with working at a funeral home is people come in and they are not in a good place.
Yeah.
Some people can be if they're really prepared for the death and they've talked a lot and,
and the person is very old and they've been sick for a long time.
And they're not suffering anymore and that's great. But if that's not the case, you can get someone who is just bringing in their crap to you.
I'm sure.
And dumping it on your desk. And you can be going along and everything will be fine. And then you'll mention that it takes a week and a half to get the death certificates and they will have a breakdown because that was somehow not quite what they were expecting and they're on such a hair trigger. And that's what death does to people. So if you are not a person who can smooth that over, cannot take that personally, you won't last very long because it will just eat you alive.
Yeah, it seems like if you don't want to have a bedside manner at all, go into pathology.
Yeah,
that's I think maybe what you were expecting.
Of course, yeah, and there are people who want to do very specific things in a funeral home. They just want to embalm. They just want to do makeup and hair. They just want to cremate. And if you're working at a huge funeral home, it might be possible to have that delineation of labor.
Like if you're at Forest Lawn here in Los Angeles,
if you have a huge funeral home, you might in that case be able to do something hyper specific. But most places you go, like the first job I had, I was meeting with families, I was doing the cremations, I was doing pickups at people's homes, I was going to the health office, I was just doing all of these different tasks because there's not enough time or enough people to make it specific that way.
So when you decided to go to school and to get certified because you knew that this is what you wanted to do, had you already kind of made up your mind, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it really differently? Yes,
absolutely. And it's hard to explain to people without it sounding either woo-woo or self-righteous to be like, I entered the funeral home and I started cremating and then I knew I would do this for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Or I knew this was my revolution. But it's true. I felt that very deeply. I knew that this is what I was going to be doing. I knew that it felt like something that needed to be done and that I had the skill set to do it. And over time, over the next couple of years, it became, okay, we need to have a movement. We need to have a lot of people involved in this. We need to make it clear what we're doing and why we're doing it and why death awareness is so important, why funeral home reform is so important. And so it's been, I'm not one of those people who's like, I just, and then just things started happening and it was just such a surprise and it was just overwhelming, but I'm so grateful. Like, no, this was all very planned from the beginning, which I don't know if that makes me seem more competent or more cold. I don't know, but
no,
it's true.
I think it's like what most people try for, I think a lot of people think they know what they want when they first go to college. It just doesn't always end up that way. But definitely anybody who goes into medicine, medicine didn't fall in their lap.
Right,
I mean?
right.
Like they busted their asses.
And then I was at Northwestern Medical School and I was like, what am I doing here?
What a random fluke. So yeah, I think a lot of people who do things that are time intensive, that require a lot of effort and a lot of training and a lot of like psychological focus, they do have to make that decision early on. And so you knew quite early that you wanted to do it, but you didn't want to do it like the big box funeral homes. You were having some ethical issues, right, with the way that they run their businesses. So then you started this nonprofit eventually, Undertaking LA. So tell me a little bit more about what you guys do and how what you do is different. Like, let's say I have somebody in my life who dies. Why would I maybe want to come to you?
Sure. So Undertaking LA is a licensed funeral home. It's still a fully licensed funeral home, but we want you to be as involved as you want to be. So, for example, if you just wanted a direct cremation, we do that. And we do quite a few of those for our families. So you could just call us, we'd pick your father up, bring him in, perform the cremation, return the ashes to you. But we also do all sorts of things that are not only green, but also highly interactive. So if you said, you know what, my dad is dying of brain cancer, he's at home, and we want to have him, keep him at home for a couple of days, we'd say, great, let's work out exactly how we can make that happen. And your hospice worker, as well-intentioned as they are, might go, oh no, you have to call the funeral home right away. You can't keep the body at home. And it would be our job to liaise with them and say, actually, that's completely legal. They're allowed to do absolutely whatever they want. Just call us whenever you're ready. And so we encourage people to keep the dead body at home. We encourage people to come to the funeral home and dress the body if they want to, and just be present for a while with the body. We encourage them to show up and witness the cremation if they'd like, watch the body go into the cremation machine. And if they want what's called a green or natural burial, which is just a hole in the ground and a shrouded body put in the hole, we also facilitate those as well. But we don't do embalming. We don't do more traditional, quote unquote, or conventional burial with the big vault and the casket and everything. We just don't do any of those things. So we're a niche service, niche, pun intended, but we just want to be completely transparent and for the family to be very comfortable with every part of what we're doing.
And so I think it's pretty self-explanatory for anybody listening why somebody might want a green burial, why they might want to ensure that, they go back into the earth and they fertilize the ground and all of these things and maybe don't want to be so disconnected from nature. But the idea of somebody dying at home and staying at home is probably still kind of foreign to a lot of people. So what are some of the kind of benefits of being with the dead?
Yes, natural burial is always my easier sell of those two pieces of my advocacy. I think, well, if you think about it historically, which I know we've talked about in the past, this is another reason, too, that I think so many women are involved in this movement. We call it the death positive movement. Why so many women are at the forefront of it and leading it is that 100 years ago, 150 years ago, death was a domestic task and women were in charge of it. Somebody died, everybody died at home, basically, and the mother would be the one to take care of the dead and lay the person out in the parlor and be hands-on in that way. And then at the turn of the 20th century, it started to be that men took over and made a business out of it. And all of a sudden it became, I am the only person qualified to do it. The body has to be embalmed to be safe. And I am the one who is going to take your body and charge you money for it. And that's a drastic shift. And it hasn't been that long, but it's been enough generations that we're now like, oh, keep a dead body at home? What?
Yeah, it's like so normal to us here in the West. And it's funny because when we did the KCET piece, I learned a lot doing that piece. Like I always just assumed, because I think about ancient Egyptians and Peruvian mummies, that the idea of embalming or the idea of preserving a dead body is this thousands-year-old practice that we've never stopped doing.
Yeah, and it's really not. So when you go to mortuary school, they're very into talking about embalming like it's this continuation of this ancient art. There is no connection between modern American embalming and Egyptian embalming. Those are completely separate things, completely separate preservation methods, really. I mean, they both preserve. There's that connection.
Yeah, but we don't mummify our...
No, we don't mummify our dead. And embalming as it happens in America, and really there's only a couple places. Canada does it, New Zealand does it, Australia and the UK do it to a certain extent, but nowhere like America do we embalm. And it came from the American Civil War. It came from people wanting to transport the dead from the South back up to the North, and they wanted a preservation method that wasn't a very, very expensive, huge metal-sealed casket that the body had to go in.
Or we didn't have refrigeration, right?
Yeah, it didn't have refrigeration. So it was basically like lock up the body in this vault-like casket and send it back. Or these men would follow the bodies or the battles around and set up tents on the battlefield with dead bodies, unclaimed dead bodies propped up in the front of the tent to show their handiwork. And you could come down and purchase an embalming for your dead son and bring him back up. And those were the same men that started selling embalming chemicals, that started funeral homes, that started this idea of the male funeral director. And so I think that the reason that so many women are in this movement is because so many people are starting to go, hey, wait a minute. I've been told I can't do this. This is not something I have access to. I'm not supposed to do it. But if I look at very recent history, this is something that I would have done, that I would have been in charge of, that was safe, that was legal. What happened?
And also it feels like something I could do.
It feels like
be empowered to do.
And and the thing is, when we started the funeral home, which was about 2 years ago now, there was this feeling that, okay, we're going to have to go to people's homes and completely hold their hand because people are not going to be ready to do this.
Yeah.
And that hasn't been the case at all. When you give people the information, and obviously there are people who choose to do it in the first place, but when you give them the information, they feel empowered to do it. And when they start doing it, they're like, especially if somebody has died under hospice, they've already been washing their hair. They've already been helping them get dressed. They've already been doing all these tasks. It's just they're dead now. They're a little more limp. Things have changed a little bit, but it's the same process. It's the same person.
And they've been already, I think, in touch with some of what we think of as the more negative or like grosser, quote unquote, aspects. Because I think that's really the part for a lot of people. That's sort of the line in the sand that they're not willing to cross, is like bodily fluids and gases and smells and decomp. Like that it honestly scares people because we utilize that as like a horror plot.
Exactly.
In American culture.
Exactly. And first of all, unless you have the body for 3 or 4 days, decomp doesn't happen immediately. It's not like the bacteria explode from within you and you start bloating and making smells and farts. And no, that is not what's happening. There can be fluids, though, of course. But you know, if I wasn't who I was, if I was just a normal person and you said, I want you to come to my house and help me prepare my dead boyfriend, I would be like, I don't know if I want to hook up with some random corpse and clean it. And I don't know if I want to do that. But if it's you and it is your partner, or it is your father, or it's a completely different experience. The person who died is not some random corpse who maybe has a little bit of blood coming out of their mouth. The person who is your beloved father or mother or partner or child. And that completely changes the tenor of the experience. And nobody is being forced to do this, but I have never had a negative review of someone doing this. I've never had someone say, I gently washed the face of my mother and dressed her in her favorite scarf and held her hand for a while, and it was gross and awful, and I hated it, and I
Yeah.
wish I hadn't done that. No one has ever said that. It's universally beloved as a practice.
And so one of the things that I really took away, both from your book and from the talks that you've given and the conversations we have, that we've had, is this thing that happens to a person when they watch somebody die, or when they're there after they die and they really watch the early stages of death set in, this transformational experience of like, they're really gone, which we don't always get if we don't spend time with the dead.
It's true. And again, I don't want to be, this is obviously a very strong belief that I have, but I don't want to be the person who's like, you can't grieve properly if you don't do that, because it's not, that's me, saying
Yeah.
the same thing other people would say about other cultures. Like, oh, how disrespectful that you didn't stay with your mom.
But there must be, but there is something
There
to
is
saying
something,
that,
well, there's so much there. There's so much there. And what we hear all the time is that you don't want to set a time limit for how long somebody should be with the dead body. You want to just give them the space to be with it, because what will happen is maybe it'll happen after 8 hours. Maybe it'll happen after 24 hours. Something will just shift. They'll say, okay, and then I was just done. Something was different. And I can't put my finger on it, but something shifted for me. And that's worth its weight in gold. That shift, because so many people are stuck in that loop of, I saw my dad that one last time, but he was really sick and he had that gravelly breathing and he was dying and it was so painful. He was in so much pain and I never saw him again and I never saw his body and I feel so guilty and I don't know how to move on. There's so many people with that guilt that they're carrying around, or that confusion.
you hear them say like, I never got to say goodbye.
I never got to say goodbye. And so when you sit with a body and you just let whatever happens, whatever emotions come up that you want to feel, see the little subtle changes in the body, the skin sinking down a little bit, going down to room temperature, the body looking more and more dead as the hours go on. Just taking that time for yourself, I think, is the most, even from an agnostic person, the most sacred time that you can take. And it is a ritual because it's physical. You're sitting there and you're there, and it's combined with belief that you're doing the right thing. And something just shifts in you, and it changes your grief experience. It changes how you process the death. And for me, I wouldn't do this because this is not an easy sell, this thing, but I wouldn't keep doing it if it just wasn't so beautiful and so helpful and so possible for people, much more so than most know.
Yeah. And a couple things I think that I'm thinking of as you're saying that. One, when you say it's not an easy sell, there is something to be said about the difference in price, which we'll get to. But before we do that, which I think is a good sell, but before we get to that, this idea of kind of being prepared, of maybe filling out your own advance directive, or making sure you talk about last wishes with your loved one, and then this conversation we have around being with your loved one as they die, after they die, spending the time with them. There's something very almost, I don't want to use the word selfish, but beneficial to the person who's there, right? Like, a lot of times I think the first time we really lose somebody, as an adult at least, we're partially mourning their loss, but we're also kind of mourning our own mortality.
Absolutely. I have this gentleman that I speak to who's a rabbi, and I was telling him that the two reasons that being with a dead body are so great is that, one, you get to mourn the death of the person sitting in front of you, and two, you get to experience the feelings and mourn your own eventual death. And he said, yes, I agree with you, but there's a third thing. You're also mourning the loss of everybody you didn't get to mourn for, and that you're still going to have to mourn for. So it's not only just I'm sitting there to mourn this specific person. It's this magical space out of time, because you have to take the time out of your life to be there. So it's this place that you get to live for this beautiful moment where you're completely focused on feeling and emotion, which is another thing that we don't put a huge priority on in our culture.
And most people, mom passes away, you're out of state, you fly in, you're there anyway, but what are you doing? You're like frenetically making plans and like stressing and fighting with your siblings. And this is like such a different experience for individuals to just be with the person they lost. And of course, you offer this service in that people can do it in any way they want. They don't have to physically clean the body if they want to, if they'd rather have you do that because it makes them uncomfortable. They can touch it. They don't have to touch it. They can have it at home. They can have it, somewhere else, or, there's so many different ways. Like, you really focus on kind of doing a bespoke funeral.
Absolutely. And that's a good point to bring up, because sometimes when we talk about this, I'll get the feedback, which I wasn't even thinking of, well, okay, but this sounds nice, but I'm just not prepared to have mom for 3 full days at home. Like, what? No, you don't have to have mom for 3 full days at home. No. Do whatever you want. That's the point. It's like, and let it happen as it happens. And well, it's interesting you say a service, because honestly, we don't charge for any of that at all. And that's kind of the benefit of being a nonprofit as well, is that we really are coming at it from, let's just figure out what's right for you. And we help people across the country who are never going to get their cremation business, because they live in North Carolina or they live in England or wherever. So if you have, and you were talking earlier about price point, the beauty of a home funeral is it's free. It is so free. And yes, you're going to have to pay for a cremation or a burial, but you can have the direct cremation price, which should be under $2,000. You can have that, but also have a huge funeral at your house with people coming over and a potluck and singing and dancing and chanting and sitting with the body. You can do all of that basically for free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's like, basically all you really legally have to pay for is whatever the disposal mechanism is.
Exactly.
And then I'm assuming, do you have to pay for a death certificate? Are there like some filing fees?
Yes. Yeah. So as a funeral home, so what we charge for example, our direct cremation cost is $995, I believe, or $990. And that's all inclusive. So that means we pick up the body from wherever they've died. And if we've helped you plan a whole big home funeral before that, that's all free. And we take the person to our crematory. We have to go back and forth with the filing, which is actually very complicated. And that's the one part I wouldn't recommend a family do themselves, just because the bureaucracy is thick on death certificate filing, especially in big counties like Los Angeles. We go back and forth, then the cremation process takes place, and we give you back the ashes. And that's how it goes.
And you can make your own pottery to put the ashes in. You
Absolutely.
can spread you can do whatever you want to do. You don't have to pay what the funeral for the thing with the engraved that you can go to like a mall store and get an engraved plaque. Like, do it on your own.
And it's about people knowing that, because some people want a fancy urn that's handcrafted and hand carved, and they want to pay $600 for it, and that's great.
Yeah,
I pay for an iPhone. That's the big iPhone 7 Plus. I pay more than I need to pay for a thing because it has functions or aesthetics or things that I desire. But I know it's not like I think the iPhone 7 Plus is my only cell phone option.
Yeah.
Whereas that's the deal in the funeral industry.
Yeah,
people think it's their only cell phone option, and they find out later, like, I could have gotten a Nokia for $100. A Nokia flip phone, and it still texts and make calls. I had no idea, and my family has no money, and I felt guilted into believing the rose gold iPhone 7 Plus was the only thing available to me.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And that's the problem. And it's not really any other industry that's that non-transparent.
And it's so not personal. Like, what if mom loved French antiques and you'd rather go to a French flea market and find a beautiful urn that's so befitting of her? Like, they don't have that option at the funeral home.
Exactly.
Like, you can spend the time to find just the right vessel, and you can make it a thing you do with your family. Like, there's so many options available that, you're right, people just don't know that they have.
And that activities are so good for your own healing as well. Having things to do is fun. And that's what the modern funeral home has also taken from us, is we don't have any things to do.
That's true. And then so many people find themselves going back to work when they're not ready because they think it's a good distraction. But you could be planning the party, and you're not, planning the funeral, because so much of the things that you don't know how to do are taken care of because of this service, you know? And so a couple things, we're running a long time, but there's so much more I want to talk about. So I'm going to force you into a few more minutes.
This is the rapid fire round.
A couple things that I know that people always ask, right? When they say, yeah, but isn't it dangerous to keep a body in the house? Or aren't there laws against this? Like, kind of, let's maybe debunk some of the myths around dead bodies.
Sure. Those are my two favorite that I love to debunk. Again, I'll do it again and again. Ask me 5 minutes from now and I'll do it again. The dead body is not dangerous unless your grandmother died of the Zika virus or Ebola or some wildly infectious disease, which if she was at home on hospice, she didn't.
That's true, actually. Like my grandmother, when I was quite young, my mother is Puerto Rican, and her mom died in Puerto Rico. And my mom had to travel to Puerto Rico, but the body was quarantined because she was septic. She had a blood disease. And so it was unsafe for them to have a funeral where the body was present. They had to cremate and dispose of it right away.
And that might happen. There, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, these incredibly rare situations might happen. But if they do, they're not sending that body to a funeral home to be embalmed.
No.
They're not sending,
no,
it's
they're
not
usually going
go,
to cremate it as soon as possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so in the rare case that might happen, what people get confused about is that funeral directors will tell them, we are embalming the body to make it safe for you to see. If it was really an issue of infectious disease or a blood disease, opening all the veins and draining out all the blood and putting in chemicals, none of that is helping. It's only hurting.
Yeah, no funeral director would put themselves at that kind of risk. Like,
They
I have
shouldn't.
a toxic Zika body. Yeah, let's open up all the blood vessels.
No, you wouldn't do that. And so, if a body is safe to go to a funeral home, it's safe to stay at your home, basically.
So because we do think of like death bacteria, there are actual factors, like we think of what are they called? There's putrescine and all these things that we know, cadaverine.
But those are all all the bacteria that are causing decomposition are not disease bacteria. It's totally different types of bacteria, and they're doing their job, which is decomposing the body. But that's a beautiful thing. That's, if it's a talking science here, that's a lovely thing that nature provides, is our own disposal system. Really, the only reason that we don't let nature do its work as the disposal system is that we're so freaked out by dead bodies that we have to bury or cremate or hide the body in some way right away. Whereas in nature, the body gets eaten, it just decomposes in the woods, wherever it falls to the bottom of the ocean, whatever happens to the dead body. But humans we can't take it, so we have to do something with them. So the only reason we have funeral homes and disposal is because nature doing its natural work is not working for us.
And the funny thing is, like, we already know this. In our mind somewhere we know this because we've all lost a pet. And our dead dog didn't attract flies right away, and it didn't smell bad right away. We were able to spend a few hours with our dog and hold it and while it was in our arms and cry at the veterinary clinic or at home before we decided to take it. Like, we've done this already with other organisms. Just for some reason, the human body has like a certain stigma to it.
Well, there's not a ton of films and TV and media about zombie dogs.
Yeah, there's only
and infectious dogs.
That's true. There's like Cujo. That's it.
Exactly. Let's not forget Cujo. But there's not this cultural narrative of the dangerous, evil, dead dog the way there is about the dangerous, evil, dead human.
Yeah. It's funny, but so you get, how long does it take before there is kind of a smell, like before it starts to get a little fresh?
Totally depends.
Okay.
If you have the dead body in a home that has some air conditioning, if you can get some sort of ice packs or dry ice to put around the body, refrigeration is the number one thing that grinds decomposition down to, a slow crawl.
Morgues have bodies in for weeks.
Exactly. So, unless and the deal is basically, I would suggest to someone, if you think you're really looking at 3 or 4 days, make sure of keeping the body at home, make sure that you have access to dry ice or access to ice packs or access to air conditioning, access to these things to keep the body cool, just because it will take the pressure off. Mm-hmm. But if you're thinking, I might have mom home for, 5 hours, maybe 12 hours, don't worry about it. She's completely fine. Open a window, turn the air conditioning on. And there's a really good story. A good friend of mine, her brother-in-law died unexpectedly, very young. And they had this kind of funeral. And it was going on 3 or 4 days. And he was starting to smell a little bit because I think he was outdoors or something. And she said, you know what? When it's someone you love, the smell just doesn't bother you. They weren't like, oh, Steven, gross.
Yeah.
They were like, we just want him. He had young kids. They were like, we just want him a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And so they made that choice. And that's the deal with being empowered. If someone is starting to smell a little bit and you don't like it, take it away.
Yeah.
Now it's time.
Yeah.
Now you have the proof that they're actually decomposing. Whatever. And that's actually, we had a client like that who wanted to keep the body until it started smelling. She specifically wanted that kind of proof that the person was really gone. And you know what? That's not what we would advertise our service on. But if she wants to do that, go with it.
And I assume it's a gradual process. It doesn't just all happen at once.
No. It's incredibly gradual. And it's not like you'll walk in and be like, oh, it's turned like a bad banana. It'll just be a subtle smell.
So as soon as you kind of know, then you make the call, and then it's only a matter of probably hours before everything's taken care of.
And it definitely depends. We've learned so much this year. Like if somebody has jaundice, it can happen a lot quicker. If somebody has had a bad injury, they've been autopsied or there was, open wounds somewhere, it happens so much quicker.
Well, yeah, because the bacteria can get in sooner or potentially flies or, whatever.
Right.
So it probably also depends on if you're keeping it in, like you said, a house with air conditioning or if you're outdoors where you have access to insects.
Right.
And
like it's been so interesting how many people still want to do this after an autopsy.
Yeah.
Even if dad, died in a motorcycle accident and had to be autopsied, they still want to come in and dress the body or be around and do it. So I think that we had this idea of, it's going to be a hospice thing and someone slips away into the night and the family gathers and prepares the body. But they're like, actually, no, my brother was a drug addict and he's at the coroner's office, but we still want to come in and be totally participatory. And we make it happen.
And when somebody does go in for autopsy, the pathologist generally or the medical examiner does a pretty good job of cleaning up after, right? They sew them back up at least. I always imagine the big metal table with the big sprayer that they can at least wash all the gunk off of them.
You would like that. And many of them do, but the Los Angeles coroner's office is so understaffed and overwhelmed, and they bang them out. So they sew them up, sort of, but we redo it.
Oh, that's good. So at least you have that capability too. Resuture everything, make sure there's no open wounds, and that's good. So, oh my gosh, so many questions that have been answered, so many more questions I have, but we can't keep you all day. Let's talk for just a quick second. You kind of told us a little bit about your new book, which is really partly nonfiction, you said partly memoir, where you basically have had the opportunity throughout your career to travel the world and see these different death rituals in different cultures, what we could glean from them, what maybe is beyond bizarre for us, but what we could start to kind of integrate into our own practices. What's the book called?
From Here to Eternity, Traveling the World to Find the Good Death.
Love it. By Caitlin Doughty, and that's going to be available
October 3rd.
October 3rd.
Available for pre-order today.
Pre-order. Oh, you can. You can pre-order it now?
You can pre-order it now.
Oh, well, shit. Guys, pre-order the book.
Pre-order the book, yeah. It's on Amazon. It's on IndieBound. It's on wherever books are sold.
Awesome. I'll put a link in the show notes so that you guys can see that and click through. And I'll also put a link to her previous book, New York Times bestseller, and one of my favorite books, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, and Other Lessons from the Crematory. And so, Caitlin, before you go, I ask every person who's on the show the same 2 questions.
Oh, okay.
Yes, and a lot of times I have scientists on the show, and a lot of times I get the same answers. You may give me the same answers too, but I know your perspective is different than a lot of my guests, so I'm definitely excited to ask you. Big picture, so get ready. When you think about the future, and this could be your own personal future, the future of your business, it could be the future of like humanity if you want to get really big and global about it. Whatever context is relevant to you right now. Number one, what is the thing if there is a thing that kind of you are most concerned about, that preoccupies your time, that bums you out a little. You think about the future and you're like really worried about it. But then on the flip side of it, so that we aren't totally depressed, which surprisingly, this has been a very uplifting death podcast. What is the thing that you are most excited and hopeful and optimistic about?
Oh, gosh.
I know, I'm a jerk.
I feel like we should have just started the hour with this question.
Then that's all
and
we
I would have
just
talked about how depressed I am the entire time. Especially now, this is the week that we pulled out of the Paris Accord. Well, by we, I mean Trump. I don't mean we collectively as a country decided this.
We're kicking and screaming. We
Right.
did it. And again, we're recording this on June 6th. I'm not sure quite yet when it's going to air, but it's been a week.
It's fresh. It's fresh in our minds. And I'm sure a lot of the scientists you talk to say climate change. So I'm sure my answer is going to be similar in that way. But I think where I will differ is in what makes me feel positive, which is the work that people in death and who work with dead bodies are trying to do to combat that. And I don't think that the work we do, we're not changing how we use energy, and we're not so we don't have the capability of actually reversing or stopping climate change. But what we do have the capability of doing is changing people's perspective on the death of their own selves, their physical selves, the death of the planet, the death of the environment, and how we mourn and how we face. Because if you are really in denial about climate change, you are so deeply in denial about your own mortality. Your head is so far up your butt in death denial that you can't even allow yourself to come to terms with the death of humanity and what you are doing to the planet. And so the more work that we can do to not only make people aware of that, but also say, hey, are you interested in conservation burial, where large swaths of land can be turned into natural burial grounds and also prevent development on that land? Hey, are you interested in replacing cremation with something like alkaline hydrolysis or aquamation, which is a far greener method of basically water dissolving the body as opposed to fire dissolving the body and releasing all that carbon monoxide and natural gas into the air? Can you do these things? Do these make you feel better about your own death? Do they make you feel more positive about how you live and how you die? So that is
donating your body to science.
Or donating your body to science. Yeah. And there's some very positive ways to do that, and some there's a lot of big death involved in body donation too, and corporation, but certainly a medical school is a great idea. And certainly donating your corneas or donating your skin or things, or donating your organs, obviously, are all great ideas. There's so much that we can do there, and so much that we can do to change. I don't think that we can change people's ideas on climate change unless we're facing their fear of mortality.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, honestly, if we were to interview Air President and ask him if he actually thinks he's going to die, get some perspective on death from him. I bet you he's in full denial.
I think the only thing I've ever read about him and death, other than the stuff that I have put out there and some other friends of mine have put out there, is that he has a cemetery on one of his golf courses in New Jersey where he thinks everyone is going to be, all the Trumplings are going to be buried.
He's got all the plot, he has his own private cemetery.
I think so. I don't know how aware he is of that, or if he's just, that's where he's going, but...
The other thing that I know is that he has this weird hypothesis about exercise. Have you read this?
No.
That he doesn't exercise. Because he thinks that everybody has a certain amount of quote-unquote vital energy, and if you exercise, you use it up faster.
Yes, I did see that. I really hate having something in common with Trump at all. It makes me feel terrible.
That's so good. Well, Caitlin, this has been so much fun. Oh, we didn't even mention that you have a YouTube series.
I do. I have a YouTube series. It's actually doing really well right now.
Awesome.
I started this year. I've done it for about 5 years, and everything I've ever read has said the only way to get people to get excited about your YouTube channel is to be consistent. And I was like, no, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. And I didn't do it for 5 years. And then this year I was like, fine, I'm going to put out a video a week. And I've gotten 60,000 new subscribers in the past 3 months or something, just because I am being consistent.
I get that. Yeah, the show comes out every Monday. Not always in the morning, not always, but it comes out every Monday.
That's what
at least people, they anticipate
exactly.
it.
You got to do it, man.
So what is the series called?
Oh, it's called, that was not an exciting story. I'm like, let me talk about analytics. Oh, Jesus. It's called Ask a Mortician.
Of course it's called Ask a Mortician. And you debunk things and you answer all of these questions that people have, these kind of questions they're maybe afraid to ask.
Yep. And we talk about iconic corpses. We just did Eva Perón. We talk about, we just talk about all things death and corpses and questions you've been afraid to ask.
I love it. Well, guys, I know that you had as much fun as I did. Caitlin, thank you for joining me. This was amazing.
Thank you for having me.
So much fun. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.